Welcome to the Marine Ecology Podcast, where we share conversations with the world's leading experts in marine ecology and conservation, offering an in-depth look into some of the most exciting developments in the field, as well as the lives and perspectives of the amazing human beings behind it. I am your host, Christian Wagner. This episode is brought to you by my good friends at Odyssey Freediving in Monterey, California. After my previous episode with Brady Bradshaw, I felt compelled to mention that proper freedive safety protocol is crucial to avoid serious injury and death. Brandon Burke, the founder of Odyssey Freediving, has been a training partner of mine in the past and is a longtime freediving and spearfishing instructor. He loves diving just about as much as anyone I've ever met, and his dive shop has also been the nucleus of a growing community of trained and certified freedivers in and around the Monterey Bay area. If you are interested in learning how to freedive or spear the right way, visit odysseyfreediving.com. If you don't live in NorCal, feel free to reach out to me personally, and I can help you find reputable instructors in your area. Remember, never dive alone. Today, I will be speaking with award-winning documentary filmmaker and marine scientist, Natasha Benjamin. Over the last 25 years, Natasha has led a unique career spanning the marine sciences, conservation policy, and filmmaking. She worked at MARI from 2018 to 2022, where she oversaw an ecological monitoring program within the California MPA network and directed their deep sea education program. Natasha currently serves as the Associate Director of Blue Frontier, a grassroots conservationist organization which seeks to spread scientific ideas related to sea life and conservation through books, films, and other media. Her most recent film, Sequoias of the Sea, which will be a major focus of this conversation, is one of these projects. The film won the Environment Award at its premiere at the 22nd International Ocean Film Festival in San Francisco, California, on April 13th, and it will be touring cities up and down the West Coast in the coming months. Sequoias of the Sea tells the story of a small town on the Mendocino coast, as its marine ecosystems experienced a sudden decimation in healthy kelp forest habitat as triggered by a disease outbreak among a key apex predator, the sunflower seastar, and was exacerbated by coinciding temperature anomaly events known as marine heatwaves. Sequoias of the Sea elucidates the nuances of the ecological phenomena at play and offers viewers the chance to see how this ecological disaster has made waves in many different cross-sections of society, from professional divers to indigenous tribal communities. It leaves us with the question, what's next for these immensely productive and globally significant ecosystems? Give it up for Natasha Benjamin. Natasha, first of all, I want to congratulate you on not only being a filmmaker at this point, a documentary filmmaker, but being an awarded filmmaker. On Sunday, you won the Environment Award at the 22nd International Ocean Film Festival for your film Sequoias of the Sea. So, huge congratulations there.
Thank you so much.
This is your first full-length documentary?
Yes, I've done a few short films. One short film on ocean conservation a couple years ago, but this was definitely my biggest project in terms of a full-length feature doc.
Yeah, I listened to the interview on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast, and you said it was a 4-year undertaking.
Yes, kind of from start to finish, it took 4 years. Obviously, I wasn't doing just that full time. I wear a number of different hats. But it took 4 years to develop the project, film the project, and post-production, editing, and getting it ready and submitting it to festivals, and then premiering it this couple days ago.
I thought the filming was beautiful, and I think you had a really amazing, diverse array of people you were interviewing, which gave a pretty well-rounded perspective on the issue. I guess I wanted to hear from you, like, if you were to just describe what this film is about in your own words, I would love to hear you paint a picture.
Sure. I'll start from the beginning about how we made this film and why we made this film. But the name of the film is Sequoias of the Sea, and it's about the kelp forests on the northern coast of California. And as a marine scientist and a diver and a surfer, I had spent quite a bit of time on the North Coast, and I watched these kelp forests disappear before my very own eyes in a very, very short period of time. We went from lush kelp forests on the coast that would kind of ebb and flow through the years. There were always fluctuations, to 95% loss, starting in around 2013, 2014. I started talking to folks about what was happening on the North Coast and talking within the marine science community, the ocean conservation community, and it was kind of shocking to me that most people didn't realize what was going on even within the ocean conservation community. I actually had lunch with Anna Blanco, who's the director of the International Ocean Film Festival, and my father, who is a award-winning documentary filmmaker who's been making documentary films for a very long time. The three of us were having lunch about 4 years ago, and I was telling him the story about what was happening on the North Coast and what I was seeing as a diver, this perfect storm of events. And I asked Anna if there had been any films about what's happening in our ocean backyard here in the Bay Area on the North Coast of California at the film festival. She had seen any kelp films, and there hadn't been any in the 14 years that she had been working there. So my dad kind of looked at both of us and said, "Hey, you two should make a film about kelp." And we kind of laughed. And then we started talking, and we launched on this project. And 4 years later, we have a 54-minute documentary about these kelp forests. Really what happened to the kelp, but more the story is really about the community on the Mendocino and Sonoma coast and how they've been impacted by losing this critical ecosystem that they depend on for so many different reasons.
Because you settled on bull kelp forests, genus Nereocystis. Cool stuff. Bull kelp, it's these long, slender tubes coming off from the seafloor with kind of like a balloon. It's almost like a child holding a balloon with this huge ribbons just streaming off of it. So a beautiful species to focus on. And the focus community is in Fort Bragg, California. And can you talk about why did those stick out to you specifically?
When we started the project, we cast the net quite wide in terms of the kelp story. There's what's happening in Southern California. There's what's happening in Monterey. When you think about kelp, most people think about Monterey, or they've been to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and you see those giant kelp in the tank there. That's a different species, like you just said, from the bull kelp that we focused on in the film. And then we started talking to folks, and we realized that Fort Bragg and Sonoma and Mendocino County were really ground zero of this kelp collapse. The 95% loss of kelp was found on the north coast of California, basically from San Francisco to the Oregon border. Those 300-mile stretch there, that's where we lost 95%, and specifically of the bull kelp. Giant kelp, which is what most people imagine, I think, when they hear the word kelp, which is also a large seaweed, but it has fronds, it has leaves from the bottom to the surface, and it just looks different than what you just described.
It's like vines. It's like, I love the name, the Sequoias of the Sea. And then I called Macrocystis, which is giant kelp, I call that like the jungle of the sea.
Totally, yeah. Yes, and you get caught in it when you're diving and all those things. I mean, you get caught in the bull kelp too, because it's very strong, or you used to. But right around San Francisco, that species, we get a shift, and we get primarily bull kelp north of San Francisco. And also Fort Bragg has this really interesting history of, how the town started as a timber town. They built a mill that basically took over the entire coastline of that town and was a working mill for almost 100 years. And then they shut down the mill, and the economy of Fort Bragg has changed a lot. And there was always fishing that obviously happened up there, But between the timber industry and fishing, that was the primary economy for that town. And when the mill shut down and then we lost the kelp forests, that community has been severely impacted on a social level, on an economic level. Their whole kind of resource-dependent economy has shifted, and they are shifting. And it was really interesting to talk to folks up there and see how they are trying to create what they're calling a blue economy. So let's just back up a little bit in terms of why we're here today with this 95% loss. In 2013-14, we saw kind of this perfect storm of events in our ocean changing. A number of things happened. One, there was what the scientists called the warm water blob in 2013-2014, where we saw temperatures in the ocean increase drastically. And that warm water persisted for a while. And in that shift, we also lost the upwelling that normally occurs off the coast of California shifted, and we lost that cold, nutrient-rich water that kelp depends on.
Can you describe upwelling in a little more detail? What is that process all about, and how does it impact the coastal ecosystems?
Upwelling is a critical part of what happens off the coast of California and why we see so much rich biodiverse species on the coast, from fish to marine mammals. And the birds and the whole ecosystem depends on this cold, nutrient-rich water that comes from quite deep, and it feeds that whole system. And that's why the birds come and the whales come to feed on all of the smaller fish. And the kelp forest also needs that cold, nutrient-rich water. And that shifted in 2013-14. We saw a shift in that system. And what happened was the kelp died off, which we've seen before. But this time, the purple urchins took over in a way that we've never seen. Purple urchins are native to our coast. We have them in kelp forests. They should be there. But we are seeing populations of these spiny little purple urchins, hundreds of times more than we've ever seen. They boomed. That population exploded and took over where kelp used to live. At the same time, there was a disease that was probably triggered in some way by that warm water. We're still trying to figure out what happened, but there was a disease, a seastar wasting disease, that killed off all of the sea stars, or starfish, as some people call them. And one of the main predators of those little purple urchins is the sunflower sea star, the Pycnopodia.
Super visually striking. It's got like 10 legs. A lot of people maybe
massive.
have never seen a starfish that looks like that.
Yeah, most people haven't seen it in person. It can be as big as this table. Huge, it's a huge keystone predator in the kelp forest. And it was wiped out. It is basically locally extinct as far as we know. There is maybe people have found a few specimens, but not enough to reproduce and be viable. So that keystone predator is gone. So now we have a carpet of purple sea urchins and no predator. 150 years ago, we used to have otters on this coast.
Yeah, so you used to have sea stars and otters. The otters get wiped out by the fur trade. And then the ecosystem's still persisting, but it still has these sunflower sea stars kind of keeping the grazing pressure down from sea urchins. Yeah, and I guess sea urchins, they're all prickly and spiny on top, but on the bottom they have these jaws that they basically latch onto the kelp and nibble away at it and they can eat a bull kelp pretty quickly, actually.
All they have to do is munch through the stalk, basically, and then that bull kelp is gone. I've been diving on the coast now, and you'll see like a little baby bull kelp trying to, make its way through the carpet of purple urchin, and there's dozens of urchins climbing all over it. There's no way the kelp can come back with all of these urchins. So we've got too many urchins, and we have no predator for the urchin except for us at this point. And
we're human beings.
Human beings, but it's kind of amazing. Even with the technology we have, there's there's no way we can remove and control all of these purple urchins. But one of the things that they're trying to figure out is how we can use extraction and removing to try to create some safe spots for the kelp to return. It's amazing. We actually didn't know that much in terms of the kelp kind of urchin dynamic and how to restore a kelp forest. We know, there's been a lot of research on coral restoration, but kelp is it's in terms of restoring an entire ecosystem and trying to figure out those behavior issues and just the dynamics of like how we know the urchins have changed their behavior since the kelp is gone now, and how one of the things that the researchers are doing is putting some drift kelp just and watching how the urchins change their behavior, because that's what they're normally eating.
What is drift kelp?
Little pieces of kelp that have broken off the main plant.
Okay.
And when there's a healthy kelp forest, you're getting little pieces from storms and, just activity in the ocean that come off. And when that's in the system, the urchins are happy and they're eating some of that kelp that just falls to the ground versus attacking the actual structure and basically killing it completely.
Because it's probably much easier and less energy intensive to latch on to a drifting piece of kelp. Because, any animal has to balance their budget. And if you spend a lot of energy, for example, like any apex predator you can think of, like a wolf, spends a huge amount of energy taking a kill because they're running for hours potentially, and they're going after strong, formidable prey like deer or an elk. And it's a big reward because they really cash out, because that elk can feed their whole pack. But if you're an urchin and you have to travel distances between meals, you have to eat that whole kelp, or otherwise you're gonna starve.
And another piece of this story that I found fascinating is that at this point there's no kelp, and you still have 1 billion urchins out there. So what are they doing? What are they eating? Because kelp is their primary food source.
Yeah, you described the zombie state.
Exactly. So these urchins, they're not viable. They're not doing well. These urchins are what they're calling zombie urchins. They're in a hibernative state where they don't need to eat. They basically shut down their system, and there's nothing inside. So people are like, well, we should just catch all these urchins and eat them. But these urchins are empty. They don't have any uni, which is what you would normally harvest from an urchin.
Can you describe what uni is?
Uni is actually the gonads of the urchin. Most people don't.
So they're reproductive organs.
The reproductive organs, exactly. And most people don't realize when they go to a sushi restaurant and they order uni that that's what they're eating. But yep, that's what you're eating. And it's a delicacy. I wouldn't say everyone loves uni, but it's...
You can learn to love uni.
You can. And we should all learn to love uni, because that's one of the solutions for trying to remove these urchins and then create a market for them. Like, what are we going to do with all of these urchins that we've removed? So there was a viable, vibrant urchin fishery on the north coast.
And these are for red urchins.
So the red urchins are bigger, and that's why the commercial fishery targeted them. Because when you pick an urchin and you got to crack it open, if you've got a bigger product with bigger pieces of uni in it, it's just easier to process. And what happened was, when the purples took over, they pushed the red ones deeper. The red urchins also don't have any food. They're also starving. And now that red urchin fishery, which was a key part of the Fort Bragg community and many other ports along the coast of California, is decimated. There is no more really commercial red urchin fishery. And most of the urchin divers, so the way that they catch urchin is you dive. It's not like a net fishery or a troll. It's a diver, a fisherman has to go down and individually collect each urchin, put them in a bag, bring them to the surface, and that's how you catch urchins. And that entire fishery is gone. And a lot of those fishermen are now working on removing the purple urchins.
I remember the diver that you interviewed mentioned that the pay is actually better. Are they actually better paid, or is it because of the collapse of the red urchin?
It's because of the collapse. I mean, at the peak of the red urchin fishery, you see these photos from Fort Bragg of the urchin boats just overlook. I mean, it was the amount of urchin that they were collecting, and that whole industry was very lucrative for fishermen 20, 30 years ago. And now there's also the market's shifted, and there's issues, and that whole fishery has basically collapsed. So now for these guys doing what we're calling restoration diving, which is removing purples, is more lucrative than whatever exists in their, there's a very, very small red urchin fishery that's left at this point. And the Noyo Center for Marine Science, which is in Fort Bragg, which is a kind of research and education center, is working with the commercial fishermen to get these purple urchins, bring them onto a facility on land, feed them, fatten them up, and then try to sell them to local restaurants, and not only have a market for all these urchins, but also increase awareness. And it's like a conversation starter to talk about this kelp forest issue.
Yeah, because I know personally there's people in Dan Okamoto's lab at UC Berkeley who are running a bunch of experiments on like light exposure, temperature, etc., to try to maximize that effort. It's kind of crazy to think about because I've never ordered any, but I guess we're gonna start doing that soon.
We're trying to remove the problem, which is the purple urchin, and now we're trying to get people to eat that problem. But that's not the only, there's other solutions. Like, okay, we've got, thousands and thousands of tons of these purple urchins that are right now sitting in bins on the docks in Noyo Harbor in Fort Bragg.
Just drying up. Just
decomposing. And they're using some of it for fertilizer. They're using some of the product to try to, create this market for a food product. And then there's this other group that is taking the urchins and creating usable materials out of them. And they've created something called urchinite, which is a biomarble. Like you could build a countertop out of urchins.
No way. Have you seen
yes,
examples
it just
of this?
Came out, and she was at the film festival. Verge Khan is the woman who's pioneering this work, and she's a diver, and she she learned about the story just from diving on the North Coast. I met her at Casper Beach, where they have an urchin removal effort, like a citizen science effort up in Mendocino. And she started working with Grant, the fisherman, Grant Downey, who's one of the fishermen in the film. And he was giving her urchins, and she started developing this biomarble out of it. So they just launched the product. I think the name of the company is Marvelous.
Does it feel like marble?
Yes, and it's beautiful, and it's purple, and each piece is different, and it's organic looking.
That's cool.
It's very, very cool. Again, this is not going to fix the problem, but this is a great way to create a market-driven approach, because right now you've got all these fishermen that are out of work, and there's no incentive to really go collect these urchins. But if there was a market for these urchins, especially a high-end market where there was incentive to go remove them, and you could give back money to the community and to these fishermen, then that creates kind of a circular economy where we're actually helping the kelp and we're putting people to work at the same time.
It's so genius. I really think that's the way things are going in conservation, because I feel like we're getting to the end of what you can do by just telling people, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. And corporations are, profit maximizing entities. And if there's a way to do that, if there's a way to align the incentives of the conservationists with the industry people, there's no reason why there wouldn't be synergy there. So stuff like that is super interesting to me.
And it's exciting because creating these market incentives, I think, could be a real shift and a great example of collaboration, and it's kind of a win-win for everyone. So we're looking at some of those stories because there's not one solution to this kelp issue. So we got to remove the purple urchins, and we also need to figure out how to get more kelp back into the system. because even if you remove the urchins, at this point, there's so little kelp seed in the system. The kelp spores are not there.
And there's the compounding impact is the limited genetic variability too. For small groups of organisms, they end up not being very resilient to stress because you're lacking those immune individuals potentially.
The Nature Conservancy and Reef Check and Sonoma State and all of these different institutions are coming together to do replanting and seeding as well. So you kind of have to hit it from both sides. You got to remove the urchins, and then you got to get more kelp in the system.
There's more than two sides too, because there is the overgrazing problem, which is mainly, from what we can tell, due to the lack of two apex predators, the sea otters and the sunflower sea stars. There's the temperature aspect, which is a long-term problem. Maybe someday we'll cool our oceans. Or potentially making these kelp more resilient to short-term thermal stresses or just time-bound thermal stresses.
And we're seeing more and more of those. And that's really the issue, is these fluctuations. And that's the new norm. And that's what we're going to see. We're going to get another marine heat wave. It's just a matter of time. So all this work that we're doing to bring back kelp, when the next marine heat wave hits and kills it all off again, we need to be ready for these fluctuations. We need to be ready in terms of the science, and we also need to be ready for these communities that are dependent on these resources, how they're going to move forward.
You briefly mentioned coral restoration, and coral to me is like an ideal species to do like a replanting operation because they're pretty durable. They have this shell that you can walk on. Well,
right.
You shouldn't walk on it,
No.
but they're pretty robust in general, and their main dangers are competing with colonizing algae and thermal
and
stress.
Heat,
yes.
Exactly.
But kelp, it does go through yearly fluctuations. If there's a storm, it gets wiped out. And so how do we guarantee that a good amount of these kelp plantings actually survive?
So there's a number of different issues around kelp. I mean, the good thing about kelp restoration versus coral restoration is kelp grows a lot faster than coral. So kelps can grow up to 2 feet a day in some areas with the right conditions. Giant kelp specifically, bull kelp a little bit less, but still you can almost watch it grow like in real time. This is a very fast. So that's the good news about kelp restoration. The issue is all these urchins. So they've created these platforms, these structures. They're called archive units, where they're planting little baby kelps on a structure above the carpet of urchins.
So basically something that can't be climbed.
Yes.
It's like putting your bed on a bed frame so the roaches can't get to you.
That's a good analogy. And and I think they started that project 2 years ago, and this is a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy, Moss Landing Marine Labs, that have a whole kelp they're growing kelp, and it's incredible. I got to go down to the facility. They closed the loop, so basically taking from spore to full grown, which I don't think had been done in a lab system before. So now we can bring adult kelps in, get the spores, and grow little baby kelps. And they're putting them on these archive units, these structures, to get them above the urchins.
And is it a special material to prevent urchins from climbing?
It's just a structure. It's like a metal bar that floats above the urchins, and the urchins can't climb up to it. So it's quite simple. It's nothing sophisticated, and they've done 2 seasons of planting at Big River in Mendocino, and they're just getting the data now about that. And in addition to that, they've also Reef Check and the Nature Conservancy and others have seeded rope and laid that down in areas where they've removed urchins. And my understanding was that wasn't as effective as growing out these like kind of smaller kelps, the baby ones, and putting those in the system.
It probably requires less infrastructure though. So there might be a trade-off with like how well can you deploy this across 4,000 miles of coastline? Probably it'll be
some mix of the two.
Yeah, some blend.
And this is new. This is really, this hasn't been done on this scale before. There's, up in the Pacific Northwest, there's some examples of the restoration. And then interestingly, I learned quite a bit about South Korea. In South Korea, they're doing a huge amount of kelp restoration and kelp farming. And the primary reason for that is it's seaweed, and kelp is such a huge part of their culture and what they eat. People in South Korea eat seaweed at least once a day. It's something that the community, and it's part of their tradition and it's part of their culture, and their government is spending a huge amount of effort and money into kelp restoration right now. So we're looking at what they're doing. We're all kind of trying to learn at this point.
Yeah, Korea is super interesting. I've been interested in Korean ecosystems ever since I learned about those all-female Korean dive groups, and they've been doing this for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yes.
I guess it's a very similar latitude to what we have here in Northern California, because I remember someone was telling me that they got some abalone there, and I was like, oh, interesting. And then the wetsuit thickness is the same. And then
you're like, this is familiar. There's something familiar about this.
Yeah. It's
and that's a really good point, is this kelp issue. I mean, obviously, we're talking here about Northern California, but this kelp issue is happening around the world. We've got kelp forests in South Korea, in Chile, in the UK, Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, and we're seeing these declines all over the world. And that's what's really shocking. I think we've lost 50% of kelp around the world. Bull kelp is specific. There's what we call the bull kelp highway that basically starts in Central California and goes all the way through Alaska to the Aleutian Islands. And that's where you find specifically the bull kelp species. That's the stretch. But there's other kelps in these other areas.
Other forest
other underwater
kelps.
Forests, large brown algae. And sugar kelp is the one that is mostly farmed. But in Alaska, they're farming bull kelp. So in California, you can't farm kelp commercially yet. I think that's going to change in the next few years. But on the West Coast, Alaska is really where most of that bull kelp farming is going, and it's going into food products and other products as well.
So that's all of kind of our efforts in protecting the kelp and reseeding the kelp. But yeah, then there's the predation question, which is very interesting ecologically, but it's honestly politically and socially driven to some extent, because we could put otters there tomorrow and just see what happens, but there's a whole web of legislation around marine mammals because of the harm that we've done to them in the past. But now there's a ton of different competing interests. We have the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which says you can't touch a marine mammal, and then we need them for the health of our ecosystems. At the same time, we have a lot of stakeholders who are like, we don't want the otters because they eat our shellfish, and
yes.
we profit off of that. And then we have the Kashiapomo who are like, we used to hunt otters before you spoiled the party.
Yep.
And
yep.
So it's it's
very complicated and it's very controversial, depending on who you talk to, this idea of bringing otters back. But the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is doing an assessment as we speak about reintroducing otters to the North Coast, which have not been on that coast for at least 150 years. We were able, we hunted all of the otters almost to extinction 150 years ago, but there was they found a little group, I think off the coast of Big Sur, that they were able to use to repopulate the Central Coast and bring otters back to a certain extent, not nearly to what they used to be, but if you've gone surfing or diving or just stood on the beach in Monterey, most likely you've seen an otter.
Yeah, there's some happy, healthy otters out there.
Yes.
I can say from firsthand experience.
Yes, and most of the time they're munching on something, either a crab, mussels, some invertebrate.
Or urchins.
And urchins, exactly.
And their teeth get purple. That's how you can tell an urchin-eating otter, their teeth will be purple.
While we were making this documentary, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service started doing listening sessions, kind of otter open houses along the coast, from San Francisco all the way to, I think, to Crescent City. Maybe they did one. And, all fishermen showed up, tribes showed up, scientists, NGOs, everyone showed up. And the conversation is very interesting. The fishermen are worried about what's going to happen. The recreational and the commercial fishermen are worried. One of the biggest issues, like we were talking about before, is abalone. There was a whole vibrant recreational fishery around abalone, where divers from all over, from hours inland, would come to the North Coast and free dive and dive for abalone. And it was this treasured, it's a sea snail, basically. It's like a big sea slug with a beautiful shell. Most people don't even, if you're not from Northern California or from California, most people don't know what abalone is.
Yeah, you might recognize it if you've ever seen, like, the handle of something that's very iridescent, smooth surface. That's likely going to be abalone shell.
Yeah, and obviously the tribes have been using abalone for millennia. There used to be commercial fishery for abalone, but that was shut down because of overharvesting. But they created a recreational fishery that was a huge part of the culture and the tradition on the North Coast. It was a thing you did every spring and summer. Abalone season would open up and everyone would come out there and bring the whole family and go camping and go diving and have these big abalone feed. And it was a huge part of the economy. In terms of, people went up there and they would shop and they would get gas and they would go to the local dive shop.
Are they doing this on tanks or or just free diving?
Most of it was free diving, and abalone depended on kelp. And when the kelp forest disappeared, that was kind of the final straw for abalone. And they shut it down. And not only for the recreational diving community, the recreational fishing community, but also for the tribes. And that was a huge blow. And abalone are really suffering, and they've been suffering for a while. And what's also interesting is if you go back to when there were otters in the ecosystem, otters were eating a lot of abalone. They were eating crabs, abalone, urchins. They were eating all of that. And they kept the abalone at a certain level. And when we got rid of the otters, when we hunted the otters to extinction, the abalone population boomed.
Interesting.
And if it wasn't for that imbalance, we probably never would have had a commercial fishery and then a recreational fishery for abalone, because from the records, it's showing that there was much less in the system. But without a predator for abalone, the only predator was the otter at the time, and then humans.
And it just happened to be desirable for humans, and so it kept things in check. Whereas urchins are desirable to a subset of humans.
Yeah, I mean, we don't. There's only so much data we have from 100 years ago, but we know that that the abalone population went up. We created a commercial fishery for it. It brought it down. Then we started regulating it. I mean, it took us a while to put in regulation, systems and management systems, and then it just kept, every year it just kind of kept getting worse. But one of the things that very small recreational fishery did was people were in the water and they were watching what was happening. When they shut down the abalone fishery, the tribes are not in the water, the recreational divers are not in the water. They thought maybe spearfishing would become a thing on the North Coast, but it's really hard. It's rough up there.
Yeah, and spearfishing, it's something that is not easy to master, and up there it's low visibility. It can be rough. Like, it's a lot more of a logistical challenge as well. Like, someone could be a casual ab diver and they just have their abalone spoon and they go out, pick some abs.
It's a lot different than going spearfishing.
If you want to shoot a fish, it's like, okay, now I shot this fish and I gut shot it and now it's wigging out, it's covered in spines,
and it's bleeding all over the place, and there's sharks everywhere.
Yeah,
There's a lot.
Totally different.
It takes it. I mean, diving on the North Coast is pretty intense and hardcore, but going spearfishing on the North Coast is like a whole nother level. So that really had a huge impact, and but they are talking about bringing the otters back, and we know that otters are important to have a healthy ecosystem, and we can see what's happening. So in Southern California and Central California, we saw kelp loss, but not nearly as high as we saw on the North Coast. And a piece of that is probably because there's otters in the system that helped control things.
Oh, yeah. I mean, looking at the marine protected areas in Central California where they've got otters, that was much more resilient to marine heat waves. I mean, you're talking about the blob, the quote-unquote blob. I mean, it's a funny word, but there are plenty of scientific papers that reference the blob.
Yeah, became a thing.
There's that 2014 to 2016 stretch where it was a severe, prolonged marine heat wave. And where there was otters, you saw much greater resistance and resilience to that heat wave than to the north and to the south.
Some scientists are also saying this is kind of a suicide mission, to send a bunch of otters up to the North Coast where the ecosystem is not healthy. We're not sending them into a safe, this is no promised land, and this idea that they're going to eat all the urchins, we know they're not going to eat these urchins. These urchins have no nutritional value. These are starving, empty urchins.
Yeah, otters go after healthy urchins. It's like that energy budget balancing. Like, if you're going to crack open an urchin, there's got to be healthy gonad in there to reward you. And so we can't pay them to go out to the barrens. They're going to stay in the healthy systems, and maybe they'll be able to preserve what's left of the kelp, but probably they're not going to be expanding the frontier.
I think what's important is when the kelp does come back, if you have otters in the system, it's going to create more resiliency. Okay. And that's really the way to look at it. This is a long-term solution. This is not some, quick fix, bring the otters, eat all the urchins, kelp comes back. It's more, let's see if otters can coexist in the system. But if they start eating all of the remaining abalone, because there are some abalone left, they're not doing very well, but there are some abalone, that's going to be a problem. And there's a lot of fear around that. And when you see otters in Monterey, what are they doing? They're hanging out in the kelp. And the kelp protects them, there's food, it's a whole system, and there's no kelp on the North Coast right now. So where are these otters going to be safe from sharks and other predators? So there's a lot to consider.
Yeah, there could be high mortality. I know the reintroduction of the northern sea otter in the Aleutian Islands. The northern sea otter, it's like just a bigger version of the southern sea otter. That seems to be the main distinction. And they're interesting because they go from like British Columbia all the way around into Japan and stuff and Asia. It's like a total... It's just an interesting visual. But when they were reintroduced into Alaska, was super low tech. Like, they just had a bunch of these captive and threw them out into the water, and like 90% of them died.
Yeah, and that's not a great image for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or for anyone. So they're going to, hopefully be very careful and considerate about how they do this process, because they also reintroduced otters to the Channel Islands, and that was a difficult. A lot of them died. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the otters.
And it's just like an interesting ethical question in general. For example, corals, a lot of those corals are probably going to die that we reintroduce, and that's also an animal. Obviously, looking at a coral, you don't see much humanity in it, but you do see a lot of humanity.
It's not a marine mammal.
Oh, yeah, not even close. Yeah, it's definitely a different emotional question regarding these sea otters. I think part of it might be influenced by some of the worldviews that end up coinciding with conservationism, right? People don't become conservationists because they don't care about sea otters, or because they don't care if a sea otter lives or dies, right? And it's hard to approach the problem with this cold meta-population, like I care about just a population of otters being healthy. Really, if you care about that big population, you also care about the individual otters surviving. And probably what it might have to take at some point is potentially just understanding that some of these sea otters are not going to survive the reintroduction, if it happens at all.
So there's that piece, and then just what kind of impact they're going to have on whatever remaining shellfish is left on the North Coast, and trying to balance that. And also the ecotourism side. I mean, I think there's folks that want to see otters come to Fort Bragg or Mendocino or Sonoma Coast or Bodega Bay, because that would create an ecotourism opportunity. And is that the right reason to bring the otters back? These are all questions that I think, the agencies are dealing with right now.
Well, there's the economic question for the fisheries. Probably in the short term, they'll suffer. In the long term, they'll benefit from a healthier system. And then the ecotourism is farther removed, and it might not exist currently in this capacity that you'd want. I don't know, in your film, you covered a dive shop that closed.
Yep.
Is that dive shop going to open, or are there going to be new dive shops?
So that was an interesting part of our journey. Was everyone talked about subsurface progression, which is the dive shop in Fort Bragg, and when they shut down the abalone fishery, he had to shut down. That was what, kind of between the urchin, the commercial. He supported abalone divers and urchin divers. And when those two things shut down, he couldn't survive as a dive shop on the North Coast. So now there's no dive shop on the North Coast, which is very unfortunate. You have to drive 3 hours from Fort Bragg to get to the nearest, to fill up a tank.
Really?
Yeah. It was pretty devastating for that community for a number of different reasons. Any dive community that did want to continue coming up, there was no dive shop. You couldn't get your tank filled. You couldn't, get an extra wetsuit, or you lost your snorkel, or whatever you needed. You had to drive 3 hours.
One of the coolest parts of the documentary, in my opinion, were the scenes where there's like the young group of Pomo tribe members who are being taught to scuba dive, and they're just stoked on it.
Yes.
That was one of my favorite parts, because to some extent, at least I've experienced that just being in the system is the only way to understand how valuable it is in a real visceral way. And I was wondering, how important do you think just people diving is to the survival of kelp forests in California?
Huge. And we just had a kelp panel at the International Ocean Film Festival talking about this. And I think one of the biggest takeaways in terms of how can we help the kelp, how can we get involved, how can we get engaged, is get in the water. Because as we know, because we've spent time in the water, that you protect what you love and you protect what you care about, and you tell people about it, and you get on podcasts and you talk about kelp for 2 hours and you spread the word, and that's how we're going to change things. So getting people in the water is critical. Reef Check is doing this incredible program, training tribe members, getting them scuba certified. I think there were 5 or 6 tribes at that certification, and they were doing their open water certification when we were filming. And we had, I think 16 maybe was the youngest one there, up to, grandparents at that training program. And some of them had never gone diving before, and some of them had never seen an abalone before, even though it's a huge part of their culture. And to see those girls, and you get a clip of that in the film, they were so excited. You could just feel how moved they were to get underwater. They got to see an abalone, a live abalone underwater, and they saw a little bit of kelp. There was a teeny bit of kelp in that cove where they were diving, and they came out and they were just laughing and giggling, and they were so excited. And, as one of them said in the film, these are people of the ocean. These are tribes that had depended on the ocean, and that resource is not available to them. It hasn't necessarily been taken away from them, although access has been, but The abalone, they don't have access to their abalone anymore. The kelp forest that the abalone depends on is gone. And there's no reason for them to go in the ocean anymore like they used to. And that has been a tremendous loss for them.
Yeah, it's just super heartbreaking because a lot of these practices they really had a great system for originally. Human beings have had a really, really long-standing presence in North America, in California. It was this colonizer group that wiped out these things and we've now passed very aggressive legislation to deal with that like exploitative tendency that our culture kind of has within it. It's got that bone in it. But now all those bans are extending to the people who were very responsible with the ecosystem and who like helped make it the beautiful, incredible thing it is today. Like you go diving in a kelp forest and that could be a life-changing experience. But all those same bans, all the same legislation applies to them now. And
right. They suffer because of what we did and the kind of greed and, and harming the planet. There's over extraction and then there's just in terms of our fossil fuel economy that's changing our climate. The tribes are suffering because of it. They did not contribute to this overexploitation, and their relationship with the kelp and the abalone is completely different. They're in the water and they're taking care of the resource. And I feel like we're seeing a shift for other coastal communities, not just the tribes. And that's what you're seeing in Fort Bragg is the communities are now wanting to not just take the resource, but take care of it.
We've talked a lot about your film, Sequoias of the Sea, which is an amazing film. And before we get off that topic, I want to give you the chance to describe opportunities for people to view it. How can they access this? What are the upcoming screenings?
So if you go to sequoiasofthesea.org, you can sign up to get our emails about upcoming screenings. We will be showing this film in a number of different places over the next couple months and hopefully more to come. But our next screening will be at SF Climate Week, April 24th. Then we will be also showing the film at the Mendocino Film Festival at the end of May. And we're hoping to do a lot more community screenings along the coast of California and beyond.
Yeah, I heard you had plans to go to Monterey in the works. One of my good friends, Brandon at Odyssey.
Yes.
Yeah, he's actually a sponsor of this episode.
Oh,
so
nice.
It was a small world. I was talking to him last week, and he was like, "Oh, no way." Talking to Natasha.
He just reached out to me and he's like, when is the film coming to Monterey? So we're hoping to do a screening in Santa Cruz, a screening in Monterey, LA, San Diego. So we'll be kind of moving up and down the coast.
Yeah, so make sure to check out sequoiasofthesea.org, and that website's going to keep updating. So check that every so often, and also you can follow her on Instagram.
Yes, at Sequoias of the Sea on Instagram.
Sweet. So describe to me your journey just as a person of the ocean. How did you develop your love for the sea? I know you're a surfer, but yeah, tell me the whole story from the beginning.
Sure. So this journey started a long time ago. When I grew up, my father is from Florida and Miami and spent a lot of time in the Keys. So when I was growing up, he was always taking me down to the Keys, and he's a diver and he's a spear fisherman. And as soon as I could swim, he took me snorkeling, and that was it. I was hooked. And I remember the first time we were snorkeling, we did a trip actually to the Bahamas when I was quite young. And I was trying to snorkel and swim, and I was talking at the same time, and I drank so much seawater because I couldn't stop talking about everything I saw. And that was the beginning, and then we would spend every winter down in the Keys diving and fishing, and I just wanted to be in the water and on the water, like from, a very, very young age. We spent a lot of time in the Keys diving, and even as a young kid, I was starting to see things change there. as we know, the coral reefs off the Florida Keys have changed dramatically in the last 50 years. I remember just like the fish that we were getting smaller, and the beautiful staghorn corals and the brain corals that I used to see when I was a kid. I didn't see them when I was a teenager, and I was watching things change in real time. And that kind of propelled me. I think I was probably like 10 or 11 when people would say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I want to be a marine biologist. I want to be Jacques Cousteau. I knew from a very, very young age, which is very unusual. I have 2 teenagers now who I wouldn't say have any idea what they really want to do when they grow up. And that's pretty normal. I was one of those kids that was super focused. I lived in New York City. I grew up in Manhattan, which was not the best place to grow up when you want to be a marine biologist. So I tried to figure out ways to stay connected to the ocean. I worked at the aquarium, the New York Aquarium. I was a docent. And
in high school?
In high school. And that was great. And that was a great experience kind of in that whole conservation world.
Did you have a favorite exhibit, or what kinds of things were you teaching people?
I worked with the belugas. And, at the time, this was, a few decades ago. There wasn't really the awareness that there is now around having marine mammals in captivity. I don't think they have any marine mammals now at the aquarium. This was on Coney Island in New York.
Oh, all right.
When I was younger, I definitely was into the whales and dolphins, which is where a lot of young, budding marine biologists start. And that's what I thought I wanted to do. I was obsessed with dolphins. But when I got to college, I went to Boston University, and they have a marine program, and you get to spend a semester in Woods Hole studying at the marine biological laboratories in Woods Hole, which was amazing. You're working with some of the most world-renowned scientists, and you are living in Cape Cod, and it was an incredible semester. And so in college is really when I shifted much more. I became a fish head, or an ichthyologist. And I wanted to study fish. I think what interested me really was, after growing up diving and seeing all the fish in the Keys, and also being around a lot of fishermen, I was drawn to that culture of fishing communities and these coastal towns, and how fishermen were interacting with the environment. And that's kind of where I started my career, was working with small-scale fishermen who were dependent on a resource that they were extracting and providing food for people, but also seeing that they needed to protect that resource. After grad school, I came out to San Francisco and started working with small-scale fishermen. And that's kind of where my interest in fish and fisheries and how do we build sustainable fisheries came from.
Did you start surfing in California, or did you learn how to surf in Florida?
I didn't surf until I was 40 years old. So it took a while to come to surfing.
You're a longboarder.
And I'm a longboarder.
What kind of board do you ride?
I have a 9-foot log. So I like small waves.
All right.
And I always, that's one thing, my dad did take me diving as a kid, but he wasn't a surfer. And I just wasn't in that world. And when I moved to California, after spending 20 years in California, I was just trying to find ways to get in the ocean. And everyone seemed to be surfing out here. I was down in Santa Barbara. We were doing some work in the Channel Islands at the time. I was working with Marine Applied Research and Exploration, a deep sea ROV group that collects deep sea data. And we had a couple days on the mainland, and I was like, I'm taking a surf lesson, and that was it. I was totally hooked.
I love to hear it. 'Cause you're also a surf photographer. Your Instagram, Mermaid Warrior 18. One of the cooler Instagrams out there, I think. I mean, you photograph mavericks, and you also photograph beginners riding bubbles to the beach. I think it's a great blend. Tell me about your journey as a surf photographer. When did that start? Because it's very, very high quality, so I can tell.
I've always, I was on this kind of marine science ocean track, but both my parents are filmmakers and photographers. So I was always surrounded by that. And I was the yearbook photographer in high school, and I always had a camera. And whenever we went to a party or there was any event, I was always the token photographer. So that was in me for sure. But it wasn't until about maybe 5-10 years ago that I started getting much more into photography and videography and filmmaking as really a tool to share these ocean stories, whether it was surfing or the kelp or deep sea research. I realized that, I mean, obviously I care deeply about the ocean and have for a really long time. And I've been working in ocean conservation and feel like I'm really preaching to the choir most of the time in my little bubble, my little ocean bubble. And photography and film is something that you can use to reach a larger audience. So I started spending a lot more time working on that piece. And that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 5 years with Sequoias of the Sea and other short films and photography, is trying to share these ocean stories.
How many times have you photographed mavericks? Because one of your photos, it was just like, whoa, that's a really great Mavs photo.
Only once.
So tell me the story about that.
My buddy Nick Paz, Salty Paz on Instagram, who is an amazing photographer and filmmaker, and we work together in many ways. We've collaborated together. We're working on another film project. Nick is also the communication manager for Blue Frontier, another organization I work for. He called me up and said, I got a spot on the boat. You want to go to Mavericks? And I was like, yes.
And what year was this in?
Oh, gosh. I want to say it was during COVID. So it was like maybe 22.
Okay.
The winter of 22. And there was a big swell coming, and everyone was getting ready for it. And it's hard to get out there. You have to get a spot on a boat, and you kind of have to know someone. And I've heard about Mavericks. I've watched videos of Mavericks, but I had never been on a boat at the break. I've kind of watched it from the cliffs, but it's not quite.
A lot, like, I've only ever seen it from the beach, and it's so far out. Like, when it's really going off, you get a sense for the power of it.
Yeah.
But I'll bet you being out there is just another experience entirely.
It is unlike anything I have ever done. It was like the most exhilarating and terrifying thing. We were on a very small boat, and it was probably like 25-foot swell. And you're kind of trying to stay in the channel, but that swell comes through, and all of the boat captains are talking to each other, and someone's watching the waves from the outside and calling it when we have to move, out of the way. And Nick got in the water. He's an in-water surf photographer. I was just on the boat. I've spent a lot of time in the ocean, and I spent a lot of time on boats, but I still get seasick, and that was definitely one of those days. It's very hard not to get seasick.
If you ever get seasick in your life,
yeah,
it's going to be at Mavs.
At Mavericks. I mean, even like a 10-foot swell, anyway. So, but I didn't care. I was sick, but I was still just like so exhilarated to be there. And really what's most profound at Mavericks when you're there is the sound. When that wave breaks, when that the amount of water hitting the water is just like everything is vibrating. And it was not easy. One, because you're moving up and down on this boat. Two, because you're sick as a dog. And I kind of wish I almost didn't have a camera and I could have just been in the moment, but of course I had to.
Are there any other waves you'd like to photograph, or any adventures coming up that for surf photography?
I just got back from Nicaragua. It wasn't for taking pictures. It was really a surf trip for me. It's really hard because when you're surfing and you're a photographer and you're a videographer, you want to do it all, but sometimes you just have to choose which hat you're wearing that day. So Nicaragua was about surfing, and it was beautiful, and we got to surf empty waves, which is pretty special. I didn't really realize that there were still some empty waves out there, and that means no one else was in the lineup except for us, and And it's warm, and you're not wearing a 5 mil wetsuit where you feel like, the Michelin Man.
Because mostly you're surfing up north where you need that 5 mil?
Yeah. So I'm normally wearing, I went surfing yesterday, and I was 5 mil, hood, booties, gloves.
Yeah, it's a big operation.
Yeah. So being able to surf in a bathing suit and a rash guard is, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And I definitely appreciate that.
You said your dad was a documentary filmmaker?
I am a consulting producer on the latest film that he's put out, which is called Fatal Watch, which is about global industrial fishing crimes and fishery observers that are on these large-scale industrial fishing boats. And these observers are supposed to be kind of neutral parties that are collecting data and watching what's happening at sea. And what's happening is these fisheries observers are dying at sea and disappearing.
No way. So you've got a huge fishing vessel.
Yep.
And basically a law enforcement, someone there to enforce the law.
Not to enforce it, but to observe what's happening and document it.
Okay, basically...
And report back.
Give you a report card, and then they're disappearing.
Disappearing and dying.
The rest of the crew comes back.
And they don't.
So they're obviously... This is crazy.
It's insane, and no one knows. I mean, when you say fisheries observers, everyone's like, what are they, who are these people? But these are people, and we have them in the U.S. So the NOAA, National Marine Fisheries, has fisheries observers on American vessels.
And even on the beach, it's like you come out of the water, and they're like, oh, can I see your permit? Can I measure that fish, make sure it's legal?
So that's usually done by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, or that on the beach when you come in. But on big commercial boats, you have an observer. It's usually one observer, and in the U.S. it's very highly regulated. Our fisheries are the most regulated in the world. But in the film focuses on what's happening in Africa and Asia and the Central Pacific. These are boats that are fishing in the middle of nowhere on the high seas.
Yeah, international waters.
Yes, where there's no one is watching except for these observers. And it's really a story about global industrial fishing and the problems and the corruption. But we track these missing observers to kind of give it the human element of what's really happening on the high seas.
What are the malpractices that are the most damning, that people would have the greatest incentive to remove their fisheries observer?
So they're catching either they're catching illegal fish that they're not supposed to catch that are protected. Shark finning is another huge thing that's illegal but happens all of the time, where you catch a shark, you cut off its fin, you throw its body overboard because the fins are highly prized. Or that they're fishing in a protected area, in a marine protected area, which is an underwater park basically, and they're not allowed to fish there. So the observer is seeing all this happening. That's on the fishing side. And then there's just the human side of what's happening on the boat with the crew, and the slavery at sea and the injustices that happen on these boats with the crew, which is a whole nother piece of it.
So some of these crew are not free individuals?
Some of these crew end up staying on boats for years at a time and never get to go back to land.
So what is that film called, and when is it being released?
So Fatal Watch, you can go to fatalwatch.com, and we just had the premiere last month at the Sonoma Film Festival and the DC Environmental Film Festival, and we're hoping to, stay tuned on where it's coming next to a film festival near you.
Awesome. Fatal Watch. I will remember that.
Most people have no idea, and most people walk out of the theater dumbstruck in terms of just I had no idea what this is happening, and how could this be happening?
Yeah, because fisheries, in the U.S. even, a lot of people don't eat fish. Yep. But they are a huge industry. And then to see the criminal activities behind them, it's kind of makes you view the world in a slightly different way.
Most of the world depends on fish and seafood as their main protein source. I mean, we're, most of the world, when you look at all of the coastlines in all of the countries, the U.S. is not one of those, and we're more of an industrialized agriculture system here. But basically these big fishing boats, these industrial trawlers, are taking away the main protein source for local communities and artisanal fisheries, and it's a huge problem.
You're also a producer of the Rising Tide Ocean podcast, which is another marine ecology podcast. They've got like a playful approach. That I like the sea shanties intro music. You appeared on that, and then on the way over here, I listened to the most recent episode with I forgot his name, but he's a former NOAA.
Yep, Craig McLean.
Yeah, and they were talking about some of the political state of atmospheric sciences in the U.S. under the current presidential administration.
So Rising Tide Ocean Podcast, I think we're on episode like 130 something. And it's a project of Blue Frontier, and who I work with, and it's a podcast that comes out every 2 weeks, and it's really ocean stories. Whether we've interviewed everyone from Sylvia Earle to Paul Watson, scientists, fishermen, business leaders, congressmen, a huge mix of different ocean voices. So any ocean voice that's talking about what's happening politically right now or an important issue. We've had kelp episodes, of course, coral reefs, sunscreen, algae, you name it. We kind of cover a really broad spectrum. So you can find Rising Tide Ocean Podcast online or on any, whichever podcast platform you listen to. We are also on a number of different radio stations. We're trying to grow the podcast. As you know, it's hard. There's a lot of good podcasts out there, but there's not that many about oceans. So super excited that you're doing this. I mean, the more podcasts we have about oceans, the better.
Yeah, I enjoy the podcast. If you're listening this far into this podcast, I guarantee this is something you should check out.
Yeah, if you can't get enough ocean, listen to the Marine Ecology podcast and then listen to Rising Tide if you need more ocean talk.
It's a project of Blue Frontiers, which is...
Yeah, so I've been working for Blue Frontier. Gosh, it's been at least 5 years. We use media to amplify these ocean stories in lots of different ways. And then we also work on ocean climate policy issues and how that kind of those ocean climate worlds collide. The kelp story is very much a piece of that. We worked for many years to develop a framework, the Ocean Climate Action Plan, that the last administration used to develop a lot of the climate legislation that we're seeing today around oceans.
What were the nuts and bolts of that?
So there were many pieces of it, but basically creating, really kind of looking at greening our systems, whether it's ports or fisheries and ocean resource dependencies, and then creating more mechanisms for funding around research on ocean mitigation around climate issues as well. So the ocean is one of our most biggest tool that we have for climate mitigation. It absorbs an enormous amount of carbon and sequesters that carbon. And if we don't have healthy ocean ecosystems, the entire climate story is going to be really impacted. So it's this kind of balancing act of the oceans being impacted by climate change, warming water, ocean acidification, but we also need to create healthy ecosystems so we can have carbon sequestering that happens in the ocean.
You have dissolved carbon dioxide, basically just like when you open a can of Coca-Cola. That's true for the ocean as well. Obviously, it's not super carbonated, but there's some carbon dioxide in there. And then every carbon-based organism is sequestering carbon and holding it out of our atmosphere. So kelp forests, people talk about a lot as something that gathers CO2 and keeps it out of the air. It's an interesting question of how much is it actually sequestering?
Yes.
Because kelp is really hard to measure because, like we were saying, it gets trashed by dorms.
Yes.
And then it lands in other habitats and like lagoons and
on the beach.
You've probably, if you've ever gone to the beach and you've passed by a stinking pile of algae,
kelp. Yep.
You've seen kelp, but in the water it's much more beautiful.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, it's like an interesting question. Like the stuff that's in the kelp forest right now is only a fraction of how much it's actually sequestering. So,
and the kelp story is such a, it's kind of such a crazy story because we lost all those kelp forests because of climate change and warming waters and changing ocean. But we're also losing this, one of our main carbon sequestering bases in the ocean. So it's like this vicious cycle where climate change has caused the decline, and now we're losing even more of the carbon sequestering capacity in the ocean.
Yeah, I feel like every environmental issue has this kind of feedback loop. It's crazy how common it is, especially with the greenhouse gases stuff.
For sure. I mean, the kelp story and all of these, coral, kelp, declining fisheries, ocean acidification, changing ecosystems, they're all really a climate story, and this is all like us. The solution is to stop burning fossil fuels. I mean, we've already done a lot of damage, and we can see those trajectories of where we're going in terms of a planet. But ultimately, this is us becoming less dependent on fossil fuels and finding alternative energies, because the more we burn fossil fuels and release that carbon into the atmosphere, it's causing that vicious cycle. And unfortunately, this is a political issue. The solution here is creating the political will to change the systems on how we use energy in this world. And the way to change that political will is for people to become aware, for people to get in the ocean and connect with nature, not just the ocean, all nature, and care about it and vote for the people who are going to make those changes, and then and increase that awareness at the bottom here. Like get people excited about what's happening in nature and care about it, and change that political will so that we stop this system that is killing us.
Yeah, I know in Santa Cruz there's there was like a year ago a proposed marine protected area at the Pleasure Point area. And I don't know how that situation shook out, but at the time, it's undisputable that, if you make a no-take zone, right, there's going to be more fish. And fish are also smarter than you give them credit for, and they know the safe spots. And, like, if you go to a protected area, go diving, you see so many fish, and they come right up to you, put a spear gun in your hand, no fish. And if you go to, like, historically fish populations in tropical areas, that's even more true. But the main argument that I heard for not establishing that no-take zone, that MPA, not all MPAs are no-take zone, but this, I think, would have been, was if you take away the spearing, you take away the people who care and who are going to be voting. And, like, it could be a net loss, actually, to overly protect that ecosystem from responsible recreational activities.
A very selective one in this case, which is spearfishing, which is probably, in terms of extraction, I would say one of the most targeted, no bycatch.
Oh yeah, I mean, you're not accidentally catching anything. You choose your fish.
And it takes an enormous amount of energy to catch that fish. Yeah, no, there's a lot of arguments around that. And marine we've got 124 marine protected areas along the coast of California that took a long time to establish those, and a lot of conversations with fishermen and scientists. And we have some of the most highly protected waters in the world. And it's amazing that we have this chain of underwater parks, but at the same time we lost 95% of our kelp. So marine protected areas are really important for certain things, but it's not the only solution. We still need to work on climate change and fossil fuel emissions and changing the political system and the industry system. Wind is a big conversation right now. And I don't think much is going to happen for the next 4 years, but that might shift. But we need to do it smart. We have to be smart about how we do it.
Because I know that you mentioned you had a whole host of interviews that kind of broached topics that didn't necessarily fit within the scope of the 54-minute documentary that you produced. You mentioned you were going to make short films out of those, but do you have any plans to make...
Right now I'm taking a breath. I'm not jumping into any big projects right now. We want to get this film out there. This in some ways is just the beginning. You spend 4 years making a film and then you enter the phase 2, which is to get your film out there. Yes, we had 300-400 people show up on Sunday to watch it, which was amazing. But we want to reach a larger audience. We really want to reach people outside of our ocean conservation bubble, outside of the Bay Area, and tell this story. So I'm probably going to be spending the next year doing the film festival circuit, working on distribution, doing community screenings, partnering with other NGOs. So it's kind of this, it's still, it's just the beginning in some way. I am working on some side projects. I wouldn't say I think my next project, I would like to do a short film. I'm working on a couple surf films that, stay tuned, hopefully.
Can you give a teaser?
Yeah, so Nick and I, who I mentioned before, are working on a project with Mando, who's a shaper and a surfer, and we're looking at surf equity and how the lineup is changing and becoming more diverse, and how kind of the culture around surfing has really, really changed in the last 5, 10, 20 years, from a very kind of male-dominated macho sport to much more inclusive. And there's a lot going on in the Bay Area and in California, like usual, kind of where California tends to be the leader in this. So yeah, so that's one of the next project, probably.
What do you think are the main driving factors there? Because I think everybody who's spent significant amount of time in the surf, they maybe have detected a generational divide. I think like in the 80s, especially in NorCal, Santa Cruz, like real aggressive territorial people. But I think the younger generations, especially with social media, like you have these big surf accounts out there that a lot of young people watch, and like surf memes and stuff.
So you're getting younger people, you're getting more just inclusivity, and then there's these new programs getting inner city kids in the water, Surf City Project and Me Water Foundation, and a lot of these local groups, and also getting surfers. I think surfers and divers are innately interested in the ocean, but maybe don't quite understand their connection and the whole kind of conservation and need to steward that resource. So that's something I'm really interested in looking at as well. Maybe that would be another project, but getting surfers more involved in ocean conservation. Surfers have a love-hate relationship with kelp. It grooms the waves. When the wind turns around, it kind of cuts the wind chop. But at the same time, when there's a lot of kelp, when you're surfing, your fin gets caught on it.
Yeah.
It slows you down. But I'm really interested in looking at how the surf community and the dive community, and getting those folks more engaged in how they can participate and help protect our ocean.
What are the best ways for them to do that?
There's lots of organizations that you can volunteer with. You can do beach cleanup. Surfrider is a great group. I think Surfrider is probably one of the best groups in the country in terms of finding out what's going on, getting involved at the local level with your local chapter, doing beach cleanups, and learning about some of these ocean issues. So, Surfrider's really tapped into what's happening politically. Have you heard about this film, The Cigarette Surfboard?
Maybe when I was preparing for this.
It played
podcast
at the film festival, and it's about a guy, a surfer, who was picking up cigarette butts off the beach, and he made a surfboard out of it, out of all these cigarette butts.
That's unreal.
And he got big professional surfers to ride the board and start the conversation about pollution and impacts to our ocean. And it was a conversation starter. And it's an incredible story. I highly recommend the film.
Cigarette surfboard?
The cigarette surfboard. The
Yeah.
Siggy board.
Well, Natasha, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. This has been super fun getting to talk to you and hear about all of your projects, from science to surfing and photography to education. And so it's been great getting to talk to you, and thanks so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was really nice to have this conversation.
This has been the Marine Ecology Podcast. You can help us grow by sharing this episode on social media and with friends and family. Before you go, I have several important announcements to make. Firstly, I would love to connect with all of my listeners on Instagram, where you can find me at the handle Marine Ecology Podcast. I'm on there regularly and encourage you to share your perspectives there on the topics we discussed today, whether in the comment section or via direct messaging. The topics we covered are far-reaching, and every voice is of tremendous value to me. Secondly, I have gotten a few questions about the theme music I used. I recorded this myself using 2 ukulele tracks and 2 synth tracks, along with a free percussion software. I'll make an MP3 version and post it to SoundCloud later this month for those interested. Finally, I'm actively in search of new guests. If you are a researcher, conservationist, policymaker, or have had a hand in the marine world in some other way, I would love to talk to you. If you've listened this far, hopefully you have a good sense of my format. If you're curious about coming on and having a fun, engaging conversation, please email me at themarineecologypodcast@gmail.com. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks again. It's been a pleasure having you with us today, and I wish you all the very best.